Good day, Steve, and great to be talking to you again.
Good to be here, Henry. One of the disadvantages of being in a COVID-safe part of the world is I'm too far from you guys, but if I was any closer, we'd still be talking through a computer screen, so what's the difference?
We probably would. There's lots of things we could be talking about, but I was really keen today to talk about your recent published article, Macroeconomic Modeling, which might seem like quite a dry topic, but obviously in the context of people thinking about the future post-COVID, how the interaction between debt, economic strategies, and so on is going to be absolutely crucial in terms of determining the sort of strategies governments take. So I want to start. Could you just give us a very brief summary of the main points of your article, assuming people haven't read it, which, given it's an academic argument, may well be the case.
Okay. Well, the title's Emergent Macroeconomics, Deriving Minsky's Financial Instability Hypothesis Directly from Macroeconomic Definitions, and it's published in the Review of Political Economy, which is a non-orthodox journal that accepts non-neoclassical papers. And what I'm doing pretty much in the paper is bringing together all the various things I've been working on in the last really close to 25 years on the role of money and credit and private debt in the economy. And of course, according to mainstream economics, there is no such role. If you read Ben Bernanke, Paul Krugman in particular, anybody involved in standard neoclassical macroeconomic modeling, they don't include private credit, private debt in their models at all because their money is just an intermediary. Now, that was fortunately blown out of the water by the Bank of England in 2014 when they came out and heavily sided with non-orthodox economists like myself. We're going right back to the days of Basil Moore, who said, look, banks create money when they lend. They're not intermediaries, they're money and debt originators. And so I've been working on that since I wrote my first paper on Minsky, modeling financial instability back in 1992. And this brings together my work on Minsky, my work on formalizing Basil Moore's arguments about endogenous money and showing the role of the credit system in aggregate demand, and also showing you don't need microeconomics to have macro.
Brilliant. So yes, just endogenous money is the same idea that banks create money, isn't it? For people. Brilliant. Yeah. And the last point, yes, maybe just to start with the last point first, maybe, is that one of the things that you challenge is this idea that's holds sway to such an extent that you quote, I think is it Bernanke saying, what else can you do with a macroeconomic model but base it on microeconomic foundations? Can you give an idea of what the significance of saying that macroeconomic models should be based on macroeconomic fundamentals rather than microeconomic fundamentals?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to that. I mean, the first thing is I agree with the neoclassicals. We need to have a foundation for macro. And their nomination is that the foundation of macro is micro. But what is going on there is, if you look at, for example, chemistry, would you say the foundation of chemistry is quantum mechanics? Because ultimately, chemical bonds involve bonds between atoms, which involve fundamental particles, which involves quantum mechanics, et cetera, et cetera. Biology, for example, depends on chemistry. Would you say that to understand biology, you must first be able to explain how chemistry creates life? Now, that's absurd, clearly absurd. And other sciences have realized that you cannot derive a higher level of aggregation system from what they call constructionism, by going from lower level elements and deriving the higher level. Economists still believe you can do that because they managed to miss out on what's called the complex systems revolution in economics and in physics and mathematics, which started about 50 or 60 years ago. So they believe you can only derive macro from micro. The reality is, with a complex system, you cannot derive a higher level of behavior from a lower level. You have to work at the higher level itself. And I just saw an excellent example tweeted out by a good friend of mine who runs the Jolly Swagman podcast. And he said he read an example of somebody saying, take, for example, carbon. If you combine carbon with carbon, you can get graphite, okay, which is a black, very brittle substance. You can also combine carbon with carbon and get diamond, which is a transparent, extremely hard substance. Now, you can't derive the entity called a diamond or the entity called graphite from the behavior of a single carbon atom. You can't scale it up and say, as I make it bigger, it became as I scale up to macro, I get diamonds or I get graphite. No, it's the way you build the relationships between the identical entities called carbon atoms that tells you whether you get a diamond or graphite. And that is a classic instance that you can't construct macro from micro. And economists have convinced themselves that they have to do that. And that's why they've been locked in this belief that they've got to build microeconomics from the neoclassical theory of utility maximizing individuals and profit maximizing firms. So that's just wrong in general in science.
Can I just, my understanding of agent-based modeling, though, is that in a way, agent-based models have micro foundations in a sense in terms of agents, and the agents interact in a system producing emergent properties, and they see the sort of macro as the emergent properties from these agents' interactions. So they would they not say then that you can derive or see emergent properties coming from, in some sense, micro interactions?
That's different to what neoclassicals are doing, who are trying to scale up a single agent.
Oh yeah,
and,
no,
okay, and that's
you can see macro patterns emerge or understand micro patterns emerge from relatively micro, or actually into meso structures as well, and interactions. That it's a whole system.
Yeah, so long as you allow emergent properties to actually occur, then you can get an emergent macro coming out of a micro-based, agent-based model. The trouble is then that we don't actually have data on what the relationships are between those micro entities that generates the macro patterns we see. So you find people doing our multi-agent models spend an enormous amount of time trying to calibrate the interactions so that they get the macro data out of the model that looks like the macro data out of the real world. And I'm not against multi-agent modeling. I'm against neoclassical economics, but not against multi-agent modeling. But having said that, I find there's such a huge overhead in multi-agent modeling that the amount of work involved in building something which you try to represent a real system is enormous compared to what's involved in building a system dynamics model, which is basically a set of differential equations. And and when you're setting up the differential equations, to some extent, the parameters for those equations are actually published. They're the characteristics of the macroeconomy. So you can derive macro from macro directly, and that's what this paper is illustrating. That it's really the structure of the economy that gives its behavior, rather than the behavior of the entities within it that give its behavior.
Okay, so you take effectively emergent properties which are linked to structure and have certain relationships, so you can then model how a change in one will lead to a change in another, effectively.
Well, fundamentally, I mean, it's simply saying that to use Marx's classic phrase, men make their own history, but not in times and circumstances of their own choosing. They're constrained by the past, and those constraints involve the relationships between social classes, the relationships between financial institutions and the physical economy, and so on. And most of those relationships are actually built into how we define the macroeconomy. So if you look at distribution of income, that's one essential part of the real economy. How much goes to wages, how much goes to profits. But that's left out of neoclassical thinking because they work with the abstraction of a representative agent who earns both wage income and profit income from the firm that they happen to own. I mean, God, give me a break. They completely bury all the class relations in this abstract of a representative agent, and they leave out income distribution as a fundamental level because they're working in terms of abstract agents, not workers and capitalists and bankers. So they have a micro which eliminates what you need to build a macro structure of any real relevance or interest. So, multi-agent, I've supervised at least 2 PhDs on multi-agent modeling, and I've been impressed with what both my students did. But in terms of the overall direction, I know that the huge overhead that's involved there is so great that I think the system dynamics approach, which is working from fundamentally the structure of the economy and the definition of macro entities, macro variables like, wages, profits, debt, et cetera, is more fruitful.
Okay. But does that, for it to be sensible, does that mean that the structure of the economy has to have some stability, the underlying structure? So if there was a dramatic change in the structure of the economy, you wouldn't be able to pick that up with this sort of modeling?
Well, I mean, the fundamental things like, wages. I mean, if workers stopped being paid wages or workers stopped existing, I'd be in trouble. Equally, if banks stopped existing, then debt wasn't there anymore, then my modelling would be in trouble. But I think I'm reasonably confident they'll maintain as part of the capitalist system for the next century or so.
Right. So I suppose it wouldn't be robust, though, to a feminist critique that there are so much activities, the informal economy, the caring economy, all these sort of things, obviously wouldn't appear in that sort of modelling.
Yeah, and then in that case, if you wish to include the non-paid sector of the economy, then you'd need to expand your definitions to say that, okay, a large part of production is not measured in GDP, and that's true. But then again, what I'm looking mainly is at the dynamics of GDP, of wages, of debt, of profits, and so on. So to some extent, I can take that in the background. But okay. It's a case of what do you want to model the impact of the non-paid economy on the paid economy? If you were looking at, for example, at a massive collapse caused by an ecological breakdown, then it may well be the non-paid section becomes the major section of the economy. So that sort of problem is certainly there. But fundamentally, to do what macroeconomic modelling has been for the last 50 years, what I'm doing is far simpler than what the neoclassicals do, far faster to get done, and far more accurate.
Will you, I know you're also doing some work on bringing energy into macroeconomic modelling. So will that work mean that this energy element can be brought into a same sort of framework as well?
Yeah, it's already been done. I mean, I'm working with Matteo Scriselli and Tim Garrett on a National Institute of Economic and Social Research Rebuilding Macroeconomics grant at the moment to do that. And we've managed to, as well as building on Tim's work on thermodynamic models of the economy, we've also managed to incorporate energy as the fundamental input into models of production that use the Goodwin model, which is the foundation that I'm using for this model of Minsky. So it only has workers and capitalists. It doesn't have banks in it yet, but that's simply a case of having to sit down and build the equations. And so the energy is being integrated. One interesting thing out of that is that it's much easier to bring energy into a post-Keynesian model than it is to a neoclassical, because the post-Keynesian basically has a linear relationship between the number of machines, K, capital, and the output. And that ends up being extremely empirically valid when you see machines as fundamentally ways to turn energy into useful work, or to use energy to turn matter from raw materials into useful matter. And then the linear relationship is a perfect mapping of the role of energy in doing that. And you'd also tie it with the ecological issues, because to use that energy, you must have waste. To convert the mass, you must have waste mass. And that's actually built into the models at a foundational level.
Brilliant. That is really useful, I think, to help understand what's going on here. I'd like to move on to the next element that you really highlight, and that is that your model, unlike neoclassical economics models, integrates the idea, the endogenous money idea, and that credit creation feeds through to aggregate income and so on. And you're saying this hasn't been done before, even because you sort of suggested that modern monetary theory had not actually taken this step. Is that right? Is that this is a new step that you've taken?
Yes, it is. And it's something I've been trying to do for about a dozen years. And it's something which, of course, Michael Hudson and I have been on one side of the debate, and Richard Werner as well, and most of the profession on the other side of the debate, including the heterodox schools, because fundamentally it was difficult to work out for most people how is possible to have credit having a role in aggregate demand when we have the rule that expenditure is identical to income, which is part of macroeconomics. So if I spend money buying the Mint magazine, that's an expenditure for me and identical income for you. So you add them all up, and expenditure is income. It's two different looks at the same transaction. And for some time when I was first working on this, I would say that aggregate demand is GDP plus change in debt. Now, that's not correct unless 100% of debt is used just for asset purchases. But what I've done in this paper, and I did the big preliminary to it for an earlier paper in the review of Keynesian economics, is I've got a very simple proof that credit is part of aggregate demand and aggregate income. And that's to have a sectoral vision of the economy, divide the economy into 3 sectors, build up a table, which I call a Moore table in honor of Basil Moore, where each sector spends $A per year on another sector. Say sector 1 spends $A per year on sector 2 and B per year on sector 3. And then you have sector 2 spending C per year on sector 1 and D on sector 3 and so on. And then I bring in credit in that. And credit, initially I model what's the loanable funds methodology of the neoclassicals. Credit involves sector 2 lending to sector 1, so sector 1 can buy more of sector 3's output. But of course, to do that, the money that sector 2 lends to sector 1 is no longer available for sector 1 to spend on sector 2 to spend on sector 3. So sector 2 spending goes down by credit while the sector 1 spending goes up by credit. The two cancel out. When you look at endogenous money, which is the real world, rather than the neoclassical textbook myth, in that case, the credit that I have sector 1 borrowing from the banking sector to spend on sector 3. Sector 2 is not even in the loop anymore. And sector 1 gets credit money dollars per year as new debt and spends that credit dollars per year on sector 3. And to balance that, the assets of the banking sector rise. And in that situation, credit is a net addition to both aggregate expenditure and aggregate income. So credit is part of aggregate income and aggregate expenditure, and that is new.
And that creates very different dynamics, does it, once you've put that into the model?
Absolutely, for 2 reasons. One, the scale of credit, and the bigger the level of private debt gets to be, the larger the change in private debt, which I call credit, will be. And by the way, this is a definitional thing. I've had this argument with quite a few mathematicians and economists. When you look at how accountants define debt, they define debt as the amount you owe at a particular point in time. They define credit as new debt, which is change in debt over time. So I use debt for the dollars owed and credit for the rate of change of debt, which is dollars per year. And when you do that and look at, well, just how much is credit as a percentage of aggregate demand in America, before the financial crisis, it was 15% of GDP. During the financial crisis, it was minus 5% of GDP. So it's both big, and unlike the other components to aggregate demand, it can turn negative. And that is what really drives the economy. The volatility of credit is what gives you the volatility of the economy.
So if people had been using your model prior to 2008, you would have been able to represent the crash in your model.
Yeah, and I did. I mean, in that sense, right from my very first model of Minsky, which I built back in 92, it was published in 95, but I actually finished it in August of 92. That's why I say it's virtually 30 years that I've been doing this work. I simply assumed that debt added to demand. So I had a stock flow consistent model. It was in continuous time, but I had the rate of change of debt being investment minus profits, and then profits being equal to wages minus output minus wages minus interest on existing debt. So in that sense, the investment was debt financed, and therefore, because investment is part of aggregate demand, I had credit as part of aggregate demand.
So what's the difference then with this model in terms of compared to the model you used previously?
Actually, I'm using a simpler model now in some ways than I did back in 92, because this is something that I should have taken from the wonderful, unfortunately now deceased Australian mathematician and economist Carl Chiarella. And Carl built much larger models of the economy than I do, like 10-dimensional quite frequently. But he always followed the rule, make the relationships linear. Not because they are linear, because linear relationships are more tractable. So in my 92 paper, I had a nonlinear relationship between the level of employment, the rate of change of wages, and the level of profit and the rate of change of capital, which is investment. And in this, I've simply used the linear relationships. So in that sense, it's simpler. But what I've now done is done the complete coherent explanation for those dynamics. So whereas I simply assumed that debt added to aggregate change in debt, credit added to aggregate demand in 92. I've now proven that. And with the paper I've used here as well, I can talk about, with a linear model, I can say, well, what slope of the investment function moves you from a stable system to one that bifurcates and gives you instability. So those sorts of things are technically easier. But the reality is, if you actually wanted to do it properly and actually use this as a serious model, you'd replace the linear relationships I have with nonlinear ones.
Right. So, and how, I mean, given that we've had this huge increase in debt currently due to, or government debt anyway, to finance things like our furlough scheme in here to keep the economy from totally collapsing. What sort of, if you fit that into your model, what sort of outlook do you get? I mean,
you get government debt as a countervailing factor for the instability of the private sector. And this is, I hadn't done this work when I wrote the paper that we're discussing here, but I've since built a mathematical model of modern monetary theory. And that includes government debt, and government debt's generated by deficit spending. So if spending exceeds taxation, that increases government debt. And that, as modern monetary theory advocates argue, doesn't require the government to borrow. The government's creating the money by running the deficit. And when you put that into the model, what you get is, if the government deficit increases when the economy is going into a credit-induced downturn, then that reduces the depth of the downturn. So it's complementary to modern monetary theory, but I haven't yet built an integrated model, including Minsky's financial instability hypothesis in the middle of it.
Okay.
I did do that in 92, by the way. That's my 92 paper, includes a government sector which stabilizes the economy by having counter-cyclical spending, meaning that as unemployment gets past gets higher than 5%, its spending rises, and that actually acts to stabilize the economy and avoid a total collapse.
And what about, and going forward, the stability of the economy with this huge amount of extra government spending?
It's more stable. The view that I'm taking in this model is a monetary view of the economy. And so what I'm using is my Minsky software, which I couldn't do this work without the Minsky software, which allows you to classify all financial flows as being flows into assets, liabilities, or equity, and then look at the overall integrated dynamics of an entire economy. And when you do that, you see that if you think just in terms of assets and liabilities as claims on other people, there are some assets which, if you bought a phone and it's 100% yours, that's an asset of yours which you can put a monetary value on, okay? And it doesn't have a matching liability. But talking in terms of assets of yours which are claims on other people or institutions, whatever's an asset to you is a liability to somebody else, and vice versa, okay?
Yeah.
So if you think at the aggregate level, then the sum of all interpersonal and intersectoral claims is zero.
Yeah.
Okay. The same sort of thing I'm doing for the Moore table here. Now, when you think about the banking sector, to be a bank must have positive equity.
Yeah.
That means that by definition, the rest of the economy, again, looking in terms of these interpersonal, interinstitutional claims, is in precisely as much negative equity. So if we simply had just a private economy with no government sector, by construction, the banking sector would be in positive equity and the rest of society being in negative equity. And nobody enjoys negative equity. If you do your sums, well, hell, I owe that person more than other people owe me, so I've got negative net worth. What can I do? I'll go down to the bank and borrow some money and gamble on assets or on share prices or house prices. So in one sense, the reality of a pure credit system is that it encourages speculation to try to get away from being a negative equity, which is a trap, because the only way that you get away from that negativity that way is by having a price bubble on assets. And what causes the price bubble? The level of borrowing you're doing. So you get a boom and bust cycle built into the nature of capitalism coming out of that. Now, when the government spends by crediting private sector bank accounts, and to do that, it also has to credit reserves of the banks. So the assets rise and the liabilities of the banking sector rise, and that creates money. Taxation works in the opposite direction. Tax reduces the deposit accounts and reduces the reserves. So the gap between the two can be a net creation of money. Now, when that happens, when the government spends on you, you don't get a matching debt. So the individual receiving government spending, whether it's a welfare payment or a purchase of commodities by the government off a private company, that creates net, as the modern monetary theory people say, net financial assets for the private sector. So the government ends up going into negative equity through the Treasury, as it happens when I put the whole model together. But that negative equity of the Treasury puts the remainder of the economy in positive equity. And then if you're in positive equity, you're not so freaked out about being in negative equity because, hey, you aren't. And then by being in positive equity, you're less likely to go and gamble and speculate on asset markets, and we're likely to get a more responsible economy out of it.
Wow. Well, that's really interesting reflection. I wonder, since the Bank of England has now, officially accepted endogenous money, presumably all the implications, they should or accept all the implications of that. Wouldn't they want to use your model?
I hope so, but there's no guarantee that people, by understanding endogenous money, have accepted all the implications. And this, I mean, I will tell two tales out of school, and I will not give names for one of them, okay, because it was a private conversation. But talking to somebody else once who was a leading developer in endogenous money theory, at one point in an exasperation of the conversation, I said, so how did all these people around us buy their homes? And the answer was out of their savings. Now that is straight out of loanable funds, okay? Then another person, I can mention names now because it's a published comment, Randy Ray, when he responded to Doug Henwood's critique of MMT with a very vigorous, typical Randy Ray attack on Doug Henwood, did say at one point when Doug said that you don't show any role for endogenous money, and Randy said, well, in that sense, you're correct. Endogenous money is fairly trivial because all it shows is that rather than the government controlling the money supply, controls the interest rate. Okay. Now, and therefore, he had literally said it was trivial. Now, I've been arguing for a long time it's significant, but I couldn't prove it. And what I've done now is to say, well, credit's part of aggregate demand, and it all makes sense in a modern monetary framework. It integrates with modern monetary theory. It strengthens it in many, many ways. So people don't necessarily get the implications. And so what I've done with this paper is show what the implications are. And that means that endogenous money doesn't just mean the government sets the interest rate rather than the quantity of money. It also means that credit's part of aggregate demand.
So you've created this model. Is there any way that it can get through and actually begin affecting real world decisions?
The main way it has to affect real world decisions is by economic managers to realise the level of private debt matters and the level of credit matters. And you don't want to get too much private debt in existence. Of course, we currently have, in my opinion, roughly 3 times the level of private debt we should have, because the financial sector benefits out of high levels of private debt. And we've fallen into the trap of borrowing from them to drive up asset prices and so on. But if you get this realization, it means, holy hell, we've been ignoring, there is an elephant in the room, we've been ignoring it, it's called private debt. So once you do that, then you would have government adding, not just looking at the rate of inflation and the rate of unemployment as the main indicators, but including the level of private debt and the rate of change of debt, which is credit, and trying deliberately to reduce the level of private debt to get it back into what I regard as the safe zone, which is less than 75% of GDP. So it would make a major change, but of course that would involve the central bank and the Treasury deliberately trying to reduce the level of private debt. Now that means effectively taking on the finance sector, and I just simply can't see them doing it.
But there have been warnings, haven't there, by central banks about the increasing level of private debt?
To some extent, there have been some, but it's always waffled, because how can you warn about the dangers of something you don't think is dangerous? So the neoclassical models all say that government debt is dangerous, and there's absolute garbage like Ricardian equivalence, which anybody who swallows that line, first of all, I've lived in Amsterdam. I've never seen drugs that effective in Amsterdam. What the hell are you smoking? It's nonsense stuff that's used to basically defend the neoclassical perspective. But all their focus on the evils of government debt, which equally modern monetary theory says it's nonsense, and MMT is correct on that front. But to have them come over and see private debt as being important is just an enormous shift. And frankly, I don't think any neoclassical economists, apart from one who's Michael Kim off at the Bank of England, have the emotional capability to break away from models which argue that private debt and credit and the banking sector in general can be ignored in macroeconomics.
Well, I hope you're wrong that actually this does get through, but we'll have to see. But thank you very much, Steve, for talking to us today.
You're welcome.